Chapter 4 1917 Revelation and Catastrophe. By 1917, both sides appeared less committed to gaining the tactical advantage than they were to the mass slaughter of the other side's forces. The Central Powers were hemmed in between three fronts. They would lost a great deal of power in Africa. The Western Front was in a perpetual stalemate, and the Russians had stalled their advance on the Eastern Front. Fearing US involvement after she resumed her U-boat operations, Germany was feeling the pressure. Britain was Germany's strongest obstacle. She knew that she had to strangle Britain into surrender to stand any chance of securing victory of the Great War. In mid-January, British intelligence intercepted a communication from the German Foreign Office. The communication was decoded and revealed a telegram sent by the State Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Alfred Zimmermann, to the German embassy in Mexico. This infamous missive became known as the Zimmermann telegram, revealing a proposition of alliance between Germany and Mexico. Germany would provide the necessary support for an attack on the southern states to reclaim historic land taken from Mexico by the United States. The telegram was quickly dispatched to the US government. The plan was announced to the US public, and demand for US intervention increased pressure on Washington to re-evaluate its position of neutrality. On February 1st, Germany resumed its U-boat blockade with the intention of crippling Britain by preventing food and resources from reaching its shores. German U-boats began indiscriminate attacks on merchant ships, including the US steamer SS Housatonic. On February 3rd, the US finally ended diplomatic ties with Germany in response to the attack. Germany was playing a dangerous game, but it knew that in order to triumph over the Allied forces, Britain had to be heavily compromised. In Mesopotamia, the British had regrouped after the fall of Kut al-Amara and surrender of British troops to the Turks. It was yet another humiliating defeat for the British Army. In response, London prioritized a second siege to reclaim the city from Ottomans. On the 23rd, the fresh surge of British troops reclaimed the city in the Second Battle of Kut. The British drove out the Turkish forces while sustaining 3 times fewer casualties than their adversaries. On March 8th, the victorious British forces marched on the claimed Baghdad within 3 days. In Russia, mass demonstration by civilians in St. Petersburg, fueled by anger over the incredible losses Russia had sustained on the Eastern Front, developed into a violent revolution against Tsar Nicholas II. In the days that followed, a mutiny by Russian forces strengthened the revolution. Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate on March 15th and appoint a provisional government to run the war efforts. The new leadership was quickly established, and the Allies urged the new Russian government to maintain the Eastern Front against the Central Powers. On the 26th of March, British forces advanced into southern Palestine from Egypt. Their goal was to capture the city of Gaza from Ottoman control. The British did well. They scored land and nearly captured the city. However, they withdrew from Gaza over concerns that the dark of night would be detrimental to the occupation, and the Ottoman reinforcements were much larger than had been anticipated. This withdrawal led to British defeat. In April, the Second Battle for Gaza began. The British were eager to try and recapture the town following the failure of their first attempt. But this time they were met with strengthened defenses and the deadly Ottoman infantry. The British were killed in the hundreds. The Ottomans held the town. On April 2nd, Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, gathered the US Congress to seek approval for a declaration of war against Germany. After their deliberation, Wilson was provided the authority he needed on April 6th, and the United States declared war on Germany. April proved to be a highly successful month for the German Navy and Air Force. German U-boats surpassed their targets for sinking merchant vessels destined for Britain. In the skies over the Western Front, German aircrafts downed British fighters at a vastly superior rate, shooting down over 150 aircraft in April alone. During this period, which became known as Bloody April, British pilots had a life expectancy of just 2 to 3 weeks. Despite this, the Royal Flying Corps was refused the use of parachutes. It was reasoned that pilots would be more likely to bail out and let their aircraft fall into the hands of the Germans if they had parachutes. On April 9th, the Allied forces launched the Second Battle of Arras on the Western Front. British, Canadian, and Anzac forces attacked the German defenses. The battle was part of a larger offensive coinciding with a French offensive further south that was hoped would ultimately break through the German lines and lead to a war of movement that would repulse the German forces. It was hoped that if the offensives were successful, they would end the war in 40 days. On the first day of offensive, the British made headway into German lines, capturing over 3 miles of territory. The Canadian captured the strategically important higher ground at Vimy Ridge, but at a high cost. Further south, the Allied forces failed to secure any real ground, as they were hounded by major German defenses. By the end of the first day, strong groundwork in the north had secured the Allies some strategic gains, albeit with heavy losses. However, as the battle progressed, the Allies failed to utilize their advantage, as was the case in the First Battle of Arras, and the Germans managed to shore up their new lines. It was a costly Allied victory that eventually stalemate returned to the Western Front once more. On April 16th, the French began their part of the assault along a 25-mile stretch of the German lines just south of the Hindenburg Line, a heavy line of German defenses. It was known as the Nivelle Offensive, as it was masterminded by France's new commander-in-chief, Robert Nivelle. The attack was designed to be the most crucial element of the entire Allied April offensive. The plan was to smash through the German lines whilst the British were occupying German forces further north at Arras. Once through, the French were to loop around and meet with the British to the north and chase the Germans back until they surrendered. The first stage of the attack secured the French a partial capture of German lines. The Germans advanced using the barrage tactic, which involved waves of men advancing behind and in front of the strong artillery shelling. However, the advance didn't progress as quickly as expected. The Germans obtained good intelligence from aerial reconnaissance photographs and quickly grasped the French plans. The offensive failed miserably and incurred major losses in exchange for insignificant gains. General Nivelle was promptly dismissed from his position. The failure of the Nivelle offensive, along with the terrible living conditions in the trenches, caused about half of the French divisions to refuse orders and mutiny. Nivelle's successor, General Henry Freeman, the hero of Verdun, ordered suppression of the resistance by carrying out large numbers of arrests and executions to set an example. He has then quickly dispatched to the Western Front to restore order. There he promised not to command another assault that would incur masses of casualties in the aim of securing minor gains. Soldiers were sick of the ongoing war of attrition. For more than a year, British, Australian, and Canadian soldiers had been digging a tunnel and laying mines under the Messines Ridge, a position held by the Germans. On June 7th, the British detonated the 19 mines, which triggering a massive explosion that wiped out over 10,000 German soldiers in an instant. The Allies then moved in and forced the Germans to fall back to a position further east of the battered ridge. On June 13th, a squadron of 22 Gotha G4 bombers carried out the first bombing raid on London using airplanes. Previous bombing raids over England and had been carried out by Zeppelins. The bombs killed over 150 people and wounded a further 400. On July the 1st, the first batch of American troops landed at the Western Front. On the 2nd, King Constantine of Greece abdicated, giving way to a pro-Allied democratic government that swiftly joined the Allies. Also on July 1st, the Russians mounted their final and unsuccessful offensive against the Central Powers on the Western Front. The Kerensky offensive began at Galicia with the intention of fighting all the way to the city of Lviv. The Russians bombarded the Central Powers with massive shelling and were initially able to make some gains into enemy lines. But the Central Powers stood firm and were able to contain the Russian advance. In the Russian ranks, mutiny was thick in the air. Divisions of men refused to follow their officers into battle, leaving combat to the cavalry and artillery, which was limited without their infantry backup. The clumsy assault, paired with disobedience, caused the Russian army to fall apart. The Central Powers seized the advantage and smashed the Russian forces with a deadly counterattack. The remaining Russian soldiers fled back to their lines. On the 6th of June, an Arab assault called by T.E. Lawrence seized the Jordanian port of Aqaba. The port allowed access to regional allies in order to assist the British in their fight against the Ottoman Empire. On July 13th, British forces, then the prime defenders on the Western Front, began their third offensive at Ypres. It was yet another attempt to break through the German lines. It became known as the Battle of Passchendaele. The British managed to capture a section of the German front line, but were prevented from proceeding due to red-eyed artillery and atrocious weather conditions that turned no man's land into a swamp. In August, the battle resumed. The British main aim was to take out the German artillery that had held them up, but the attack failed and once again the Allies halted the campaign, whilst the Allied higher-ups reviewed their strategy. On the Eastern Front, the Germans secured their final victory over the Russians in the Battle of Jokla. The Germans, who had employed new methods of attacks, saw out the Russian forces from the town of Riga, ineffectively led to the collapse of the Eastern Front. In late October, Austro-Hungarian and German forces engaged the Italian army in the Battle of Caporetto on the Italian frontier. The Central Powers succeeded in weakening the Italian army and managed to push them back over 60 miles to the south, where, exhausted and battered, over 300,000 Italian soldiers surrendered to the Central Powers and more than 400,000 fled. British and French forces scrambled to redeploy divisions from the Western Front to aid the Italians. But the advance of the Central Powers was too extreme. On November 6th, Canadian troops succeeded in capturing the village of Passchendaele, but it was a limited victory. After 3 months of sudden, deadly warfare, the Allied offensive was cancelled. Both sides sustained over 200,000 casualties, all for piecemeal territory gains. On November 7th to the 8th, the Bolshevik Party in Russia, led by Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, staged the October Revolution, which dissolved the Russian provisional government and supplanted it with a Marxist Soviet government. The revolution put an end to Russian involvement in the Great War, and shortly after the takeover, Russia signed an armistice agreement with Germany. with the Eastern Front gone, but Allies and Central Powers knew that victory for either was depended upon American reinforcements. In late November, the British staged an attack at Cambrai, an important rail support point for German forces. The Battle of Cambrai was the first time heavy tank divisions were deployed on the battlefield. Nearly 400 metal-clad machines pushed into German lines and enabled the British forces to advance and capture over 5 miles of land. However, as was much of the story of British successes in the Great War, the gains were not exploited and the Germans returned with heavy reinforcements. After their 5-mile trek, the tanks began to falter and posed little threat to the German counterattack. Winter arrived and froze no man's land. Russia had begun the year ruled by the last figure of 300-year-old dynasty, but by the end of the year it was a communist Bolshevik nation. The Germans no longer had to fight on the Eastern Front and instead were free to focus their efforts on the Austro-Hungarian frontier and the Western Front. But where one giant fell, another awoke. All eyes were on the Americans. The Central Powers knew that if it did not act first, the Americans could very easily turn the tide in favor of the Allies. The world was as the Great War entered its final year.